Okay guys, so we're going to talk about your use of multimedia tools in your teaching to enhance your courses, making it more exciting and interactive for your students. Are any of you using images? Anne, can you tell me about any of your practice in using images and why that might be important for your students?
Yes, in our computer-based learning material we include images to brighten up the material, engage the students with it, and use colour as well. So we use things like graphs and maps, that sort of thing we'd use within our material. So yeah, and the students enjoy that engaging material.
And I guess it's really important to see images. Sarah, is anything from your experience?
Yeah, well, I teach anatomy, which is a really visual subject, so we use images a lot in all of our materials, labelled and unlabelled, sometimes with an additional level of interactivity so that students can add or remove the labels to use for revision purposes as well.
And is this something that you have set up yourselves in terms of putting the images into your course, or have you had assistants doing it?
I've had assistants from our e-media department, but also it's something that I've done myself using something as simple as PowerPoint.
Excellent. Anybody else? Tim, any experiences of images?
Well, I'm teaching at the Institute of Education and my topic doesn't lend itself to using images for content, but I think what's really important is the visual appeal or visual framing of your online course in your BLE. And imagery can perform a function there, so you can use images for signposting, for example, and if you use imagery consistently to identify, here's a discussion, here's a particular type of activity and so on, and that can help students while they're navigating through the course. So in that respect, I think imagery is quite important, but it doesn't have to be restricted to imagery. You can already do a lot with indentation and formatting the text and keeping text at a minimum on the front page and hiding the more detailed instructions on the subpage and this kind of stuff. So I think the visual look of your online course can make a huge difference.
Great. I mean, one way that... Sorry, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say, rather like Tim, my subject in diplomacy isn't necessarily a very visual field, but what I have been able to do in designing a dissertation module is thinking about something like a literature survey, and actually to survey the field I have an image of a field being surveyed. So it's a very literal way of putting an image to a piece of text that might otherwise seem rather, uninspired.
Yeah, so it's a way of just, aesthetically enhancing the course visually, as Anne was saying as well.
Yeah, not just aesthetically, but also functionally. There's quite a bit of research on these subjects, and one important thing there is that the images should always kind of reflect the message of the text and so on. Because if they contradict, then you have this cognitive dissonance, and there's this dual coding theory and so on that goes into it. So yeah, both have to match.
Yeah. I mean, one way that I shared images in my practice is via Twitter, so I might use Instagram via Twitter to send out. Does anyone use Twitter in their teaching? Simon, have you got any examples where you've used Twitter?
Not particularly for my teaching, but in terms of my research, and actually as a means of research-led teaching, I suppose that does impart those images and the use of Twitter to my students. But I think part of the sort of number of layers to which Twitter works, so there's a means by which you can sort of outward communication, there's a dialogic function to it, and indeed a sort of reflective function of it. So in all three regards, students have the opportunity to engage with me and people who I might follow across that sort of spectrum.
There's something quite powerful about being on Twitter, and I think celebrities have it as well, that you're a real person and you can be, people can talk to you, or students can interact with you at times that maybe previously they wouldn't have been able to. Sarah, any examples of practice of Twitter in the Vet College?
Yeah, well, I use Twitter, again, to engage with my students. We have a small core of students who are very interested in multimedia. So they use Twitter, they use specific hashtags related to their course or their module, so they can find resources that they would think other students would be interested in, tweet those out to a wider audience. And I myself might pick up on those and retweet them so that any students that follow me can access them that way as well.
Fantastic. Any other examples of use of Twitter?
Well, on my Masters of Research program, we have a program-wide hashtag and Twitter channel, so people post interesting resources on there. But we don't really have a systematic way of using Twitter or embedding it for educational purposes. And I personally feel that sometimes there might be a danger that communication might become a little bit too fragmented, going on here and there and there and there. And so we try to keep it all in one place as much as possible. But having said that, I fully recognize the use of Twitter, of reaching out to the wider world and bringing the wider world in, which is something that I think UCL as a whole wants to propagate more and more in the connected curriculum context.
I think it's quite a good point that not all students will be interested in engaging with something like Twitter, and I think from my experience it is just small numbers of students using Twitter in that way, but it's about offering diversity of choice, isn't it, in terms of engaging students who have particular learning styles and like to learn in different ways and in different places. So I think it's a valuable thing to do.
I suppose in a subject like diplomacy, which is based so much about communication, reflecting on the different channels of communication is really important for the students' overall learning and working towards the specific learning outcomes of any particular program, but also about their participation in a dialogue of their learning and being reflective, actually. And Twitter can be quite useful for that. It can also serve any number of other purposes, and some of them, and there are some sort of darker aspects to it which we should be wary of as educators, but nevertheless the means of communication is so powerful that we'd be foolish to ignore it, I think.
The use of video is really important in our MOOC. We're teaching our participants different techniques and ways of incorporating video and screencasts. Have you got any examples of practice where you've created screencasts or used video? Anne, is there anything that you're doing?
We've recently seen that our distance learning students want some sort of human interaction. They want to see somebody there. So we've been looking at ways about how we can incorporate them. So we've done it in several ways. We've started with talking heads videos, for instance, as myself as programme director or the module organisers, just to say hello to the students, just so they know who they're talking to. And then we also use screencasts where we're using sort of slides with audio, and that might be as an introduction to a module and to take them through what they're going to expect to learn, that sort of thing. And then we're also looking at videos as well, perhaps sort of little bite-sized videos to explain points in different ways, where it just helps some points easier to understand if you can actually hear them being spoken rather than written down. So we're trying them in a sort of a variety of different ways.
And is this stuff that you're creating yourself? Are you having a go and using the software? And if so, how do you find that?
Yes, it's great. We are using the software ourselves, and we're teaching our tutors and our module organisers to use them. And it's great because you can just sit and do it at your own desk and in your own time and make sure you get it right. And that's great. And the tutors themselves like to do it as well. You know, it's nice for them too.
Great, thanks. Anybody else want to add in?
Quite recently, I took over a fully online module on education and technology beyond the classroom, which is fully online, so fully distance learning. You never ever meet your students. And it didn't have any video except for an introduction. But as I was taking it over, I had to obviously produce it from scratch with my head on it as an introduction. First of all, I think it's really important to establish the social presence, to humanize education, because it's quite important for students to feel that there's actually someone at the other end who is a normal person you can contact, and it's a real person and not a robot or some artificial intelligence telling you what to do. And in terms of the production, at this time we can produce things so easily. And with this video, I took the module over at the last second. So I just sat myself down at home on the floor, put a tablet computer on a chair facing me, and that was my recording. With a little bit of editing, it was done within 10 minutes or so. And then writing up the transcript, which is pretty important for accessibility reasons, and that took a little bit longer. But you can produce these things quite easily these days, and it is valuable at these specific points.
I suppose just as a word of some caution in some regards, in that I've used video to an extent, but and maybe it's just the discipline that I work in, but it being quite text heavy, some of the videos that I've seen have actually been rather distracting from the subject matter rather than complementary. And I think that's just one of those functions where the educator needs to think about, is this the best means of achieving the learning outcome they want to? And sometimes there can be such an overdose of video, and perhaps individuals who have a lot to say want to say it to camera. And that's not necessarily the most effective way for a student to learn, whatever that topic may be. And I think there needs to be a very thought out process of, is video the best way to do that? I take Tim's point about the sort of socialisation and accessibility of the subject, and putting a human face and a course team behind that learning process is very valuable to getting that level of engagement with the subject, whatever it may be. But that's really, whether that's best served by video or another means is really up for, the educator's discretion.
I think that's a really valuable point, because I think from my point of view, students tend to crave these passive type learning opportunities when actually we want them to engage and interact in some way. I found that for using videos and e-lectures, that keeping them very short helps a little bit with that, but also making sure that the e-lectures that I do produce are based around really key concepts or things that students typically really struggle to understand. I can think of a particular example where every year at exam time I have a queue of students outside my office waiting to talk to me about a particular mechanism, and by just producing a very short 5-minute e-lecture, that's really helped students being able to go away and explore those things on their own and hopefully understand them a little bit better.
That was brilliant. And do you want to tell us about the use of lecture recording software at the school?
Yes, in our programme we have both a distance learning version and a London-based version. And with our London-based lectures, they're now recorded, so we're able to make those recordings available to our distance learning students. But they are hour-long lectures, so going on your point, they're not bite-sized, but the students do appreciate them. We stress that we provide the key learning material, but they're like a sort of add-on, so they just hear the material in a slightly different way, and they really appreciate that.
We've just talked about a number of different formats of how to use video, and I think there's quite a bit of potential in doing more with that. And at the moment, what we've mentioned is effectively talking heads, screencasts, recording narrated something on the screen, and then lecture recordings. But actually, you can be so much more creative with video, and that is probably something that is not really on the minds of people. Like this format, what we're doing here, having a panel discussion can be quite interesting for the viewer, because they're actually witnessing how an exchange is going on and how people are bouncing ideas off each other. But we can be much more creative with that. On the flip side, a lot of videos that are produced are also not very well produced. One of the most horrible cases is when a lecturer produces a talking head video and doesn't even look into the camera. That is really bad. And there's actually research also pointing out that talking head that doesn't engage with the viewer is actually distracting from the subject matter. So don't do that.
I think that's a really good point. I think the point about discussion, something like this, would actually be a great way forward to look at.
But I think that reflects back on other educational practices. Actually, this is an opportunity to think about what's the value of the lecture. The individual stood there talking to a room full of people, as opposed to having a panel discussion like this or a bilateral sort of interview kind of arrangement. There is variety is the sort of spice of life in this regard. And thinking about sort of traditional educational practices in those lights, and then utilising new technology such as video to move that forward. That's where the opportunities lie.
The proof will be in the pudding. We'll see what the feedback's like on this MOOC and how the participants have thought, what they've thought about it.
Yes, and maybe having interactive activities after you've viewed the lectures, that sort of thing, the sort of flipped classroom that it's called. So.
So we've talked a lot about video. The final thing I wanted to mention is whenever I'm anywhere on campus, if I'm in the refectory or in the library, students are always plugged in. They've got their earbuds in. They're listening to something, whether it's music or podcasts or I don't know what. But have any of you got any experience of producing audio files or podcasts for your students so they can access additional bits of learning outside of the classroom?
I have some experience here, and what I've mainly do is provide a sort of commentary to a course. So by that is sort of my reflections on this is what this week's topics were either about, so it's either preemptive or sort of post facto or preemptive, sort of we can do it one of two ways. But it's just having that sort of commentary. So this week we were talking about, for example, the Treaty of Versailles and the impact on the 20th century of that particular conference and the participants and all of the issues that arose from it. But just to reflect on that through the subsequent decades and my opinion in 2016 as to what that means for the subsequent century, I suppose. And that all of those kind of things, just an opportunity for my reflection, rather than to particularly point out this is what was said, this is who was here, etc., etc. But actually, it's just that sort of, as I say, reflective capacity that's useful, I think.
Do you do these podcasts or recordings yourself? Is it easy? What kind of software are you
using?
using?
I'm just using very basic sort of voice recorder, something on my phone, maybe an app there, or I have had a little voice recorder in the past. I can use the headset off my desktop computer. I don't pay a great deal of attention to the production value in that sense, other than that it works, and it's clearly audible. There are occasions when, fire alarms will go off and I have to redo it, but generally it's just my reflections and that's how I do it.
I haven't used audio for content delivery purposes as such, but I have used it for feedback purposes. So it's quite nice for a student to be able to hear a bite-sized audio of the person who's read their work, and that's really easy to do in something like Turnitin or GradeMark. Just record a very, very short message to the student, and actually it increases the personalisation of that feedback, and they get, I think, a lot more out of a very, very short piece of audio. It's easier for you to make as well. It takes you a lot less time than writing out a couple of paragraphs. I think you can get lots of very useful feedback over in that kind of way.
I must say, ironically, even though I used to be a sound engineer, I am not using recorded audio for education, I am afraid. However, I am using it in a similar purpose as you, Sarah. We have an activity where students are making presentations online through a web conference, and afterwards we discuss issues, and I'm giving them feedback on the fly in the web conference itself, and that is effectively using just audio. And so it's a live discussion more than a recording.